Welcome to Episode 4 of the U.S. Battleships of World War II series. For this episode, we are covering the South Dakota and Iowa-class battleships, the last built for the United States. Stick around to the end of the episode for an honorable mention. If you haven't seen the previous 3 episodes, be sure to check those out, which cover earlier classes starting from the Wyomings all the way to the North Carolinas. Let's get started. In March 1937, looking to address the deficiencies and build upon the North Carolina class that was being laid down later in that year, the U.S. Navy was drafting a new battleship design, strictly staying within the 35,000-ton limit due to the Washington Naval Treaty and subsequent treaties. The new class, allocated to the building program for the fiscal year 1939, would also be equipped with 16-inch guns. What also was important was having armor to protect the ships from these guns as well, which was something lacking in the North Carolina design. Originally consisting of 2 ships approved for construction in 1938, the South Dakota class, as it would come to be, went through several design iterations. The final draft brought along with it similarities to the North Carolinas, but also a number of changes to address their shortcomings. At the highest level, the ships featured the same armament layout, 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns in 3 3-gun turrets, along with 20 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 10 twin mounts. One of the ships had a different secondary armament arrangement, which we'll cover shortly. For the South Dakotas, there would be 3 major changes from the previous class, which were propulsion, armor, and most noticeably, length, at 680 feet for its overall length. The drastic shortening to a 666-foot waterline length from the North Carolina's 713-foot waterline length was due to the South Dakotas' focus on armor. The North Carolinas had 16-inch guns and armor to only counter 14-inch guns. The South Dakotas needed to be adequately protected against the guns they carried as mentioned earlier. Adding more armor, in this case 12.2 inches at a 90-degree angle, was able to do this, but to keep under 35,000 tons, the ships needed to be much shorter. This inward-sloping armor also was able to protect the ships better from possible underwater shell hits, mitigating the danger to the machinery spaces and magazines. A shorter ship with a wide beam caused more drag than the North Carolinas, so the South Dakotas needed more horsepower to make the desired speed of 27 knots, as well as addressing fitting the equipment needed in less space. In terms of propulsion layout, the designers had the ships feature 4 machinery rooms with geared turbines, boilers, and additional equipment in a combined space. Boilers were placed a deck above in each of the machinery rooms. This is just one example of the multiple space-saving measures on the South Dakotas. They would push out 130,000 shaft horsepower, 9,000 more than the North Carolinas. Along with the belt armor mentioned earlier, deck armor was 8.1 inches, main turret faceplates were 18 inches thick, sides were 9.5 inches, and roofs were 7.25 inches. Barbette armor ranged from 11 to 17 inches, while the armored conning towers were 16 inches thick. Originally a 2-ship class, 2 more were soon allocated for construction. The first 2 ships of the class were South Dakota and Indiana, while the next 2 ships were Massachusetts and Alabama. South Dakota, the lead ship of the class, would be fit out as a fleet flagship, so an extra deck in the conning tower was added for the flag staff. Her specific design included the removal of the forwardmost twin 5-inch gun mounts and supporting equipment on each beam to make more space for flagstaff accommodations, making her secondary armament 16 5-inch guns versus 20 guns of the rest of the class. South Dakota, Indiana, and Massachusetts would all be laid down in 1939, and each were launched in 1941 before Pearl Harbor. South Dakota was commissioned in March 1942, Indiana in April, and Massachusetts in May. Alabama was laid down in 1940, launched in early 1942, and commissioned in August. When commissioned in 1942, the ships of this class at full load ranged from 44,000 to 45,000 tons. South Dakota, commissioned first in March 1942, had an anti-aircraft battery that consisted of 16 20mm guns, 28 1.1-inch guns, and 8 50 caliber machine guns. As the war progressed, newer weapons like the 40mm Bofors replaced the 1.1-inch guns, and all battleships and aircraft carriers would carry as much as possible to counter Japanese aircraft. By 1945, each of the South Dakotas would have an array of different batteries. For example, South Dakota would have 68 40mm guns and 77 20mm guns in March, while Massachusetts had 72 40mm guns and 41 20mm guns in November. Now let's cover an overview of the South Dakota class service history. After sea trials and her shakedown cruises, South Dakota's first wartime assignment was to head to the Pacific in August 1942, arriving in Tonga on September 4th. Unfortunately for her, she hit an uncharted coral reef 2 days later and damaged her bottom hull, sending her to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Arriving back in the Solomons in October, South Dakota would play a critical role escorting Enterprise in the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, acting as anti-aircraft support for the carrier. South Dakota would be hit by a 500-pound bomb on her forwardmost 16-inch turret, and would claim 26 aircraft shot down that day. Less than a month later, she would take part in one of her most infamous actions, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. On the night of November 14th into the 15th, South Dakota, along with battleship Washington and 4 destroyers, took on Japanese battleship Kirishima and her large escorting force. As covered in Episode 3, South Dakota would take part in engaging the battle force, but around 30 minutes after midnight, an incorrectly installed circuit breaker for the ship's electrical system was tripped by the concussion of her guns, disabling her offensive capabilities for around 3 minutes. During this time, she went around the burning wrecks of 2 U.S. destroyers, silhouetting the battleship for the Japanese to see, and becoming their primary target. Completely bombarded by all types of gunfire, she was hit 26 times, though the ship's survivability was not compromised. Her crew, radar, communications equipment, and other systems took a beating, so she withdrew from the battle along with the other 2 destroyers, leaving Washington to fight on her own, which famously sank Kirishima for an American victory. South Dakota's combat actions would be over for 1942. She would need to head to the New York Navy Yard for repairs, lasting into early 1943. Indiana, commissioned in April, and after working up in her shakedown cruises, would be ready for combat in November 1942, where she was to head from the East Coast to the Pacific to relieve the battered South Dakota in the South Pacific. Arriving in Tonga in late November, she would be involved in training exercises and support American troops on Guadalcanal throughout the rest of the year. Soon after Massachusetts was commissioned in May and ready for action a few months later, she would be sent off to take part in Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa on November 8, 1942. Part of the Western Task Force, she was supporting troops landing at Casablanca in Morocco, where she was the first U.S. battleship to fire her 16-inch guns in anger, in this case against partially completed Vichy French Navy battleship Jean Bart, located in the port of Casablanca. Famously, the incomplete Jean Bart had one of her quadruple 15-inch gun turrets operational and fought back against Massachusetts. Massachusetts would hit Jean Bart 5 times, putting her out of action, and would continue firing on Vichy warships trying to escape, helping sink 2 destroyers, 2 merchant vessels, and damaging dock areas and buildings. She would get hit by an 8-inch shell from a shore battery, causing minor damage, and would narrowly avoid torpedoes launched at her. Massachusetts played a major role in the successful landing and would soon head back west to Boston for an overhaul to join the battle in the Pacific in 1943. For the last of the class, Alabama, 1942 was a quiet year. She would be commissioned in August and conducted sea trials, her shakedown cruise, and getting the ship worked up for combat. In January 1943, South Dakota was wrapping up repairs on the East Coast and joined the Royal Navy in April at Scapa Flow in Scotland. Along with her newest commissioned sister, Alabama, they escorted convoys to and from the Soviet Union and would play a diversionary role to keep German battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst at bay, while the Allies moved forward with Operation Husky, the landings at Sicily, Italy, in July 1943. In early August, both would be recalled to the Pacific for their involvement for the upcoming Central Pacific campaigns. In the Pacific, Indiana was supporting operations in the Solomons with battleships North Carolina and Washington in the early months of 1943, serving in the role as escorts for transport convoys. Massachusetts, after her overhaul in Boston, made her way to the Pacific and would get to Noumea, New Caledonia, in March. Supporting convoys for the next few months, she would join her sister Indiana and join North Carolina to provide invasion fleet protection for Operation Toenails, the landings at New Georgia in June 1943, part of the larger South Pacific campaign, Operation Cartwheel. Indiana would support fleet carriers during the Marcus Island raids on August 31st to September 1st. November 1943 would start the major Central Pacific offensive push west for the U.S. Navy, where the 4 sisters took part in many of the campaigns leading up to August 1945, either providing shore bombardment or escorting fleet carriers for anti-aircraft protection. All 4 South Dakotas were involved with the Gilbert Islands campaign in November, the first of the major campaigns, which included the invasion of Tarawa, Macon, and Apamama. All 4 would bombard the island of Nauru. In January 1944, with the U.S. Navy's push to the west in full swing, out of all major operations in this year, a majority of the time 3 out of the 4 South Dakotas supported operations, including the Marshall Islands campaign in January, the raid on Truk in February, Palau Island strikes in March, Hollandia in April to June, and the Marianas Islands campaign in June to August. Notably, South Dakota, Indiana, and Alabama were present at the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, where they acted as anti-aircraft batteries protecting the carrier forces. South Dakota was hit by a 500-pound bomb, killing 24 men and wounding 27, while Indiana was hit by a Japanese torpedo bomber, and luckily the outer plating of the ship was dented, with no major damage. Class minus Indiana would also be present with the carrier forces during the battle off Cape Engano, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines in October. Alabama, slightly damaged from Typhoon Cobra in December, would be detached for the West Coast. South Dakota and Massachusetts would continue supporting the Philippines campaign leading into 1945. Both ships would support the carrier raids in the South China Sea of early January. Alabama would still be in the yard as the 3 other South Dakotas were involved with the invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945. All 4 would partake in the Battle of Okinawa, starting in mid-March for shore bombardment through June, though some supporting operations at different points throughout the multi-month battle. After Okinawa, as the U.S. Navy pushed even closer to the Japanese home islands, all 4 South Dakotas would be involved with shore bombardment on industrial centers during July and August. Massachusetts had the honor of being the U.S. battleship to shoot the first and last 16-inch rounds in anger during World War II. The first round, of course, during Operation Torch in November 1942, and the last round at Japanese iron and steel mills in August 1945. Out of all the South Dakotas, South Dakota herself was the only one of the class immediately present during the Japanese surrender, September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay. During World War II, South Dakota received 13 battle stars, Indiana 9, Massachusetts 11, and Alabama 9. After the war ended in September 1945, all 4 South Dakotas were soon placed into the reserve fleet, as they were access to post-war Navy needs. As the 4 Iowa-class ships, which we'll discuss shortly, were in service and were more modern and capable, it was unlikely for the South Dakotas to be recommissioned. There was a blip of hope for some of the reactivations, however, in 1954. A study was conducted to see if a South Dakota-class ship could reach 31 knots. However, the aft 16-inch gun turret would likely need to be removed to make space for better propulsion. It was also theorized that the aft of the ship would need to be extensively modified, and all electrical systems would need to be upgraded. This all resulted in high estimates of conversion costs, putting an end to the potential program. There were also concepts of converting some of the ships into guided missile battleships, replacing the main battery turrets with missile launchers, but those plans also stalled. All 4 ships were stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1, 1962. The first 2 of the class, South Dakota and Indiana, would be slated for scrap. South Dakota would be sold for scrap in 1962, and pieces of her would be saved for the USS South Dakota Memorial in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, along with other artifacts at the U.S. Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. Indiana would receive a similar fate. She was sold for scrap in 1963, and some of her parts would make their way to permanent homes in Indiana, such as her bell, prow, and main mast. Some of her low background steel was recycled to be used at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Washington State. As for the last 2 South Dakotas, Massachusetts and Alabama, they had different stories. Massachusetts would be saved thanks to several sources, such as her crew lobbying to make her a museum ship and school children in her home state donating to save the famous warship. In June 1965, ownership was handed over from the Navy to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and in August 1965, she was towed from Norfolk, Virginia to Fall River, Massachusetts, where she is the main attraction at the Battleship Cove Museum to this day. Alabama had a similar story. The Alabama state government passed a bill named the USS Alabama Battleship Commission to preserve the ship, with around $800,000 raised in 1964, mostly from corporate donors, but a good portion of donations were from Alabama schoolchildren. The ship was transferred over to the state, with a clause stating that the ship needed to be in good shape just in case the Navy needed to take her back for emergency service. After the U.S. Navy handed her over in Seattle, Washington, she made her way through the Panama Canal and up to Mobile, Alabama in September 1964, over 5,600 nautical miles away, making it the longest tow of a non-active warship. She would be open to the public as a museum at Battleship Memorial Park in Mobile in January 1965. In March 1938, the United States, United Kingdom, and France invoked a new escalation clause to the Second London Naval Treaty to increase new battleship tonnages to 45,000 tons. This in part due to Japan's concerning Navy building program after they withdrew from the treaties in 1936. The U.S. Navy, with the previous South Dakota class, addressed balancing their new 16-inch gun fast battleships. However, one factor of the firepower, armor, and speed triangle was never fully realized. Creating a balanced ship with speed to make it a true fast battleship was the focus for the next class, with the desired 33-knot top speed. Speed was concerned for the U.S. Navy as they believed Japan had upgraded propulsion plants on older ships like the Congo-class battlecruisers that would counter an American 27-knot design. Also, with such a high speed, the new class would act as a vanguard or striking force and carry the firepower needed for battleship engagements. In May 1938, the design for the new Iowa class was far enough along to authorize 2 ships for the fiscal year 1940 building program, Iowa and New Jersey. The design combined armor protection schemes and design of the superstructure from the South Dakotas with the hull form and bow shape from the North Carolina class. To help get the desired speed, the Iowa's hull was elongated, giving them a waterline length of 860 feet and an overall length of 887 feet. The Iowas were the longest U.S. battleships built and a little more than 200 feet longer than the South Dakotas. The ships also had a beam of 108 feet, similar to previous designs, just shy of the 110-foot wide Panama Canal locks they needed to fit into. Her design deviated from the singular combined boiler and engine rooms as the North Carolinas and South Dakotas, creating separate alternating spaces for their boiler and engine rooms, with exhaust trunking up 2 funnels. Power was dramatically increased to 200,000 shaft horsepower to help get 33 knots. Main armament consisted of 9 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 guns in 3 3-gun turrets. Each gun is 5 calibers longer than the previous 2 classes, which allowed increased muzzle velocity that let shells travel farther and penetrate more armor. The 50 caliber guns were modified to fit into the previous 16-inch 45 caliber turret design. Secondary armament consisted of 20 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 10 twin mounts, 5 on each beam. Notably, all Iowas featured the all-around walkway conning platform higher up on the superstructure, known as Stryker's Bridge, which was incorporated onto North Carolina after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Iowa's armored citadel is 464 feet long, starting right at the first 16-inch gun turret and ending at the aft end of the third turret. Armor consisted of a main armor belt that was 12.1 inches thick at a 19-degree angle sloped inwards, with the main armor deck at 1.5 inches, the second deck at 6 inches, splinter deck at 0.625 inches, and third deck between a half an inch and 0.625 inches. Turret barbette armor was at a maximum of 17 inches, and the armored sides of the conning tower were 17.5 inches. Main turret faceplates consisted of almost 20 inches of armor, 9.5 inches for the sides, backplates 12 inches, and roof plates at 7.25 inches. At full load, the Iowas would have a displacement of more than 57,000 tons. Iowa would be fit out as a fleet flagship and had an enlarged conning tower with an extra level to accommodate more personnel. She would retain her full secondary armament, compared to South Dakota of the previous class that lost 2 5-inch mounts due to space issues. Iowa and New Jersey were ordered in July 1939, laid down in June and September 1940, launched in August and December 1942, and commissioned in February and May 1943. 2 new ships, Missouri and Wisconsin, were allocated for fiscal year 1941 and were ordered in June 1940, laid down in January 1941, launched in January 1944 and December 1943, respectively, and commissioned in June and April 1944, respectively. With the 2 Ocean Navy Act of 1940, which rapidly expanded naval building programs due to the uncertainty in Europe, the procurement of 2 more Iowa-class battleships was part of the program, along with 8 Essex-class fleet carriers. 2 additional Iowas were ordered in September 1940, which were Illinois and Kentucky. However, they would never be commissioned due to the doctrinal shift to aircraft carrier building during the war. Illinois was laid down in December 1942 and never launched, only 22% complete by August 1945, and was broken up in 1958. Kentucky was laid down in March 1942 and wasn't completed during the war. Her uncompleted hull was launched in 1950, and her bow was famously used to repair Wisconsin's damaged bow after collision in 1956. She was brought up as one ship to use as a guided missile battleship, but those plans also stalled. Her hull was scrapped in 1958 as well. Now for the class's service overview during World War II. Iowa, the first of the class to head into action in 1943, made her way to Newfoundland in August to provide cover for the Allied convoys headed to the Soviet Union and back to the United Kingdom. She also served as part of a force to combat German battleship Tirpitz if needed. However, Tirpitz was neutralized for the time being in September thanks to Royal Navy submarines setting off mines under her hull. In November, Iowa would famously leave the U.S. to head to Cairo and Tehran to deliver a special passenger, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, to war planning conferences. Her escort force, consisting of the destroyer William D. Porter, carried out practice torpedo runs, where she accidentally fired a live torpedo towards Iowa. Iowa avoided the torpedo, which exploded near her starboard quarter, and Porter's crew was ordered to Bermuda for an inquiry on the near disaster. After escorting the president back to the U.S. after the conferences, Iowa made her way to the Pacific to take part in the Marshall Islands campaign in late January, along with her combat-ready sister, New Jersey. The two ships escorted carriers that conducted raids supporting the landings on atolls such as Kwajalein and Eniwetok. In mid-February, the two sisters took part in Operation Hailstone, the raid on Truk, where they fired on enemy ships for the only time in their careers. With a combined battery of 16-inch and 5-inch guns, Iowa and New Jersey sank the light cruiser Katori, destroyer Makaze, and minesweeper Shauna Maru No. 15. As the Pacific Fleet continued west on their island-hopping campaign, Iowa and New Jersey took part in escorting carriers and providing shore bombardment during the following campaigns: Marianas Islands raids during late February, the Palau Island strikes in March and April, and the invasion of the Marianas in June. Both were present during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th to 20th, where they were part of the fast battleship detachment west of the carrier fleet and provided anti-aircraft protection, but were not engaged to fight the Japanese fleet. In October, both ships supported the landings at Leyte and were infamously with the carrier fleet during the Battle of Cape Engano, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, another missed opportunity for the Iowas to engage battleships. As operations continued later into the year for the recapture of the Philippines off Mindoro and Luzon, Wisconsin joined the action in early December. In January 1945, the last of the Iowas, Missouri, joined the fight off Luzon. From there, 3 Iowas, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin, were involved with the South China Sea raids, Iwo Jima, and the invasion of Okinawa starting in March 1945. Iowa was out of action due to damage from Typhoon Cobra in December 1944, where she would rejoin the fleet off Okinawa in mid-April, relieving New Jersey. Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin would take part in the Allied bombardments and raids of Kyushu in May, and Hokkaido, Honshu, and Tokyo in July. During the war, only 2 of the Iowas would suffer combat damage. The first was Iowa in March 1944. During the bombardment of Mille Atoll in the Marshall Islands, she was hit by a 6-inch shell and 4.7-inch shell, causing negligible damage. The second was Missouri. She was hit by a kamikaze off Kyushu on April 11, 1945, where a Mitsubishi A6M0 hit the starboard side below the weather deck, causing small fires, and was quickly extinguished. Parts of the plane landed on the deck, and there were no American casualties. As the surrender of Japan was being planned, Missouri was chosen as the ship to accept the formal surrender on September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay. The ship was cleaned and painted for the occasion and hosted the 23-minute-long ceremony starting around 9 a.m. local time. Lead ship of the class Iowa was also present in Tokyo Bay that day. In terms of lighter anti-aircraft throughout their service during the war, gun count and type didn't range too much. For example, in February 1943, Iowa had 60 40mm guns and 60 20mm guns, and by the end of the war, each Iowa had around 80 40mm guns, and some had 50 20mm guns. During the war, Iowa earned 9 battle stars, New Jersey 9, Missouri 3, and Wisconsin 5. All would see active service post-war, being decommissioned and reactivated multiple times. All 4 Iowas served during the Korean War at different points, and New Jersey would see service during the Vietnam War. In the 1980s, all 4 would be reactivated and modernized under President Ronald Reagan's 600-ship Navy program, a program to re-strengthen the U.S. Navy to counter the Soviet Union. The ships would remove 4 5-inch mounts, 2 on each side, and install systems to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and Phalanx, Sea Whiz, Gatling guns, and drones. The ships would also serve in a variety of theaters and roles throughout the 80s and into early 1990s. Missouri and Wisconsin would take part in Operation Desert Storm in 1991 to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. Each of the Iowas were decommissioned in the 1990s and are now all museums, with clauses that the Navy can take them back if needed. Iowa became a museum in 2012 and now calls the Port of Los Angeles home. New Jersey was brought to Camden, New Jersey in 2000 and opened as the Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Missouri made her way to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and opened as the Battleship Missouri Memorial in 1999, facing the USS Arizona Memorial, showcasing 2 points of the war, the beginning and the end, with the signing of the surrender on Missouri. In 1998, Wisconsin was brought to Norfolk, Virginia to be displayed next to the Nauticus Museum, and it was still owned by the U.S. Navy. In 2009, Wisconsin was transferred to the city of Norfolk and a more official exhibit of the museum. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Montana class, the last U.S. Navy battleship class ordered. Part of the 1942 Ocean Navy Act, 5 battleships were funded in fiscal year 1941. These ships were named Montana, Ohio, Maine, New Hampshire, and Louisiana. Though the design was not fully finalized, these were drawn upon the principle that the preceding Iowas were to act as fast Vanguard battleships, while the new Montanas were the larger yet slower brawlers with superior firepower and armor. They would have featured 12 16-inch 50 caliber guns and 4 3-gun turrets, with secondary armament 20 5-inch 54 caliber guns and 10 twin mounts. They would have had an overall length of around 921 feet and a 121-foot maximum beam, too big to fit into the Panama Canal locks. Unfortunately for U.S. battleship enthusiasts out there, the ships would never be laid down. With the war breaking out, priorities changed, where the production of Essex-class aircraft carriers, completing the Iowas, and building more destroyers were given precedent. In 1943, the new class was canceled. Thanks for watching the final episode of the series. As we covered over the 4 installments, there were 25 battleships that were in commission with the U.S. Navy during World War II, 17 of which were in service before World War II started. An additional 8 fast battleships were built and commissioned during the war. 2 battleships were lost, Arizona and Oklahoma, both at Pearl Harbor. Here are some graphics covering all the ships discussed in this episode and prior episodes. Be on the lookout for new videos coming soon.